Mixing vocals can be challenging, but there are multiple methods that you could use to achieve a clear and upfront sound. We'll cover some of the best techniques, explain why they work, and show some examples so that you can decide if you want to try it. With that said, let's cover clear vocals, methods for an upfront sound. First up, we got parallel third formant compression. So a vocal has three formants. Each one is a cluster of vowel and consonant related information. Some are heavy on the tonal aspects, meaning they contain a lot of vowel-related information. This is the case for the first and second formants in the low mids and the mids respectively. But the third formant contains a great mixture of vowel and consonant info, meaning if it's accentuated or amplified, it becomes much easier to understand the vocalist. Simple EQ and/or saturation is a good way to increase the perceived clarity of the vocal, but one rarely discussed and incredibly effective method involves using parallel compression. In short, if we send the vocal to a parallel track, we can isolate the third formant with a linear phase EQ and then heavily compress it. So, we'll create the bus and the corresponding auxiliary track. On the aux track, we'll insert the linear phase EQ to avoid phase cancellation between the original and this parallel track once we start adding filters. Then we'll use high-pass and low-pass filters to isolate the third formant. This is typically between 2 to 5 kHz, but there can be some wiggle room to the lows and the highs. Now once the range is isolated, we'll insert a compressor and begin to heavily compress. The compressor you choose is going to impart a distinct timbre, so I recommend using one with multiple algorithms so you could switch through until you find one that augments the region in an enjoyable way. Once it's compressed, adjust the level of the parallel compressed third formant with the aux track's channel fader. This way, you can easily determine how much you need. With this section compressed and blended in, the clarifying aspects of the vocal become incredibly dense. Masking is reduced significantly, and the vocal can cut through a complex mix. Now, what I like about this method is that if the instrumentation changes, the third formant's level can be automated to account for what's needed. For example, if the chorus hits and now the vocal is difficult to hear, the aux track could be increased to accommodate it. So let's take a listen to the method and notice how it becomes easier to hear the vocal, how it becomes clearer, and how the vocal's pronunciation is improved.
Think it was impossible. May have been a bit of trouble. Think it was impossible. May have been a bit of trouble. Think it was impossible. May have been a bit of trouble.
Next up, let's cover perfect vocal reverb settings. So reverb, although a crucial part of any mix, can easily obscure a vocal. The reflections reduce clarity by making transients harder to hear, while emphasizing tonal aspects by increasing their duration. Now in some cases, you could just use reverb with a low mix amount and you'd be fine, but if you're noticing that the vocal is buried once reverb is added, and/or you want to use a fair amount of reverb, you should try this method. Now, instead of placing the reverb on the vocal's channel, use a send or an auxiliary track instead. First, insert the reverb that you want to use and dial in the important settings, like the decay time, stereo width, etc. Keep the mix at 100% so that this aux track includes only the reflections. Then, insert a compressor with an external sidechain, which is just about any compressor plugin. Set the external sidechain to the original dry vocal and ensure that the compressor is triggered by the external sidechain. Now already, you've made a huge difference in the clarity of the vocal. The reflections are ducked or pulled down whenever the vocal hits, ensuring the start of the vocal phrase has less reverb than what follows. How much attenuation that you need, how reactive you want it to be, is all up to you, but I typically use a little look ahead to catch the very beginning of the vocal and attenuate by a few dB at least. Then, I'll time the release to the BPM of the track to make the attenuation less jarring and have it blend in more seamlessly. Just be sure you don't attenuate too aggressively or with super quick attack and release settings, otherwise you'll add some distortion to the reverb, which rarely sounds good. There's one more step you could take to ensure that the reverb sounds exactly how you want it to and doesn't cover up the vocal. Remember in the first section of this video, we discussed the vocal's third formant and how important it is. If the reverb's reflections are masking that formant, the vocal becomes unclear. With that in mind, I'll add a linear phase EQ after the compressor. With it, I'll attenuate 2 to 5 kHz. This way the original dry third formant is more prominent than the reverberated one. Additionally, I'll clean up some of the lows and dip around 250 Hz. 250 Hz often masks 2 to 5 kHz. By attenuating it, we reduce masking to the third formant and retain clarity. Now, if you want to make additional changes to the reverb's reflections with this EQ, definitely feel free, but the filter shown here will keep the vocal sounding clear, even with aggressive reverb. Lastly, blend in the reverb with the auxiliary track's channel fader. So let's take a listen as I enable the reverb, then the compressor, and lastly the EQ. Notice how reverb ducking and then EQ greatly increases the vocal's clarity.
Think it was impossible. May have been a bit of trouble. Think it was impossible. May have been a bit of trouble. Think it was impossible. May have been a bit of trouble.
Real quick, Sage Audio is an analog mastering service. We've been around for 20 years, and mastering starts at $49 per track. There's a link in the description, and then there's an ad at the end of the video if you want to learn more. Last up, let's talk about controlling harmonics through phase cancellation. So harmonics forming in the low mids are the primary reason a vocal sounds muddy. Typically, the vocal's fundamental frequencies cause harmonics to form between 200 and 500 Hz, resulting in an excess in that range. Predicting a saturator's behavior is difficult since it's an amplitude-based processor, and what's triggering the saturation changes as the vocal changes. However, there's a method to reveal where the harmonics will form when working on an instrument or a vocal. In short, we could use a null test to fine-tune our saturation and create harmonics in the exact region or regions we want. To do this, first we need to duplicate our lead vocal or the vocal that we're working on. When it's duplicated, we'll add a utility plugin with phase inversion. Once the duplicate's phase has been inverted, these two tracks should cancel one another out. Now we could test this by soloing them and playing them both at the same time. If there's no output, then they've nulled. At this point, we could add whatever saturator that we want to the original vocal. I recommend Saturn II since it includes a linear phase mode that makes this process easier and parallel bands control where harmonics form. Now if we play both vocals at the same time, we could observe their differences with an analyzer. This is everything different about the original vocal and the saturated vocal, meaning we've isolated just the effect of the saturation. If the goal is a warm vocal, then we'll adjust the saturation until we observe harmonics primarily in the low mids to mids. However, since we want a clear and upfront sound, let's find a way to generate harmonics between 2 to 5 kHz. So with the other bands turned off, I'll center a band somewhere around that frequency range. Since I don't know what will trigger the saturator, I don't know exactly where to center this band. But by observing the analyzer, I could find the exact crossover frequencies to emphasize 2 to 5 kHz with harmonics. Furthermore, I could switch between different saturation types, amounts, dynamics, and any other parameter the plugin might have to fine-tune the saturation while observing the harmonics that form as a result. To quickly monitor the sound, I could mute and unmute the duplicated and inverted track. This way I could fine-tune while analyzing, then monitor the effect in the context of the mix, and then adjust as needed. Let's take a listen to some saturation that I've tuned to amplify 2 to 5 kHz. Notice how it increases clarity while leaving other ranges unaffected.
Think it was impossible. May have been a bit of trouble. Think it was impossible. May have been a bit of trouble. Think it was impossible. May have been a bit of trouble.
Get professional analog mastering that accurately translates what you hear in your head. Seriously though, when people work with us, they get results. That's why major industry professionals like Keith Urban's producer Aaron Schurz works with us, Grammy award-winning AJ Castillo, Billboard #1 charted artist Megan Lindsay, Grammy award-winning artist Tulis, The Voice singer Cody Ballou, Grammy-nominated producer Tyler Kane, Warner Music artist Ricky Young, and the list goes on. Why waste your time creating masters that don't accurately translate what you hear in your head when you could instantly fix a problem by clicking the link in the description and working directly with professionals who have already done what you're trying to do? We've mastered thousands of songs that accurately translate what each client hears in their head, and it'll work for you too. Click the link in the description now and get direct access to us for personalized analog mastering that accurately translates what you hear in your head.